We're talking today with Mr. Jim Shannon of Hendersonville, North Carolina. The interviewer is James Smither of Grand Valley State University. Mr. Shannon, can you begin by giving us a little bit of your own personal background? For instance, where were you born?
I was born in Galveston, Texas in 1928.
All right. Now, what did your family do?
We had a small dairy farm that supplied milk mainly for Galveston.
And let's see, you're kind of growing up in the 1930s and so forth. How well did your family do in that period with the Depression and all?
Well, I tell people that our clothes may have gotten ragged. We always had enough to eat.
Being a farmer is sometimes a good thing. But, let's see now, did you finish high school?
Yes, I spent most of my time in school in Santa Fe district of Galveston County to get the courses I needed to enroll in college in an engineering degree. I went to a larger school at Alvin, Texas, and graduated from there.
Okay. Now, was that on Galveston Island or was that on the mainland?
No, all this was on the mainland, and Alvin was actually in the next county, Brazoria County.
All right. So how long did it take to get to school?
Well, it was about 8 miles away, and to get there, we drove to the county line where a school bus picked us up, so it was maybe 45 minutes.
Okay, so not too bad then. Now, do you remember hearing about Pearl Harbor when it happened?
Yes, my older sister came to the barn, stuck her head through the window and shouted, "The Japs have attacked Pearl Harbor."
Okay. Now, at what point did you figure out that you might wind up getting caught up in the war? Because you were still pretty young when Pearl Harbor happened.
Well, at that point, I was caught up in the war. I knew that I would probably be in it, and I really wanted to fly. But by the time that I was old enough, why the Air Force was bringing people back from European theaters to train for the Pacific.
Yeah, so there wasn't, at certain points they were closing off access to pilot training and that sort of thing. Yeah. Well, you were still pretty young. If you're born in 1928, then you only turned 17 in 1945. Now, at that age, you can enlist if your parents allow you. You can enlist in the Merchant Marine at 16. What motivated you to join the Merchant Marine rather than something else?
I was completing my first year in Southern Methodist for an engineering degree, and I met a man in a slightly different uniform in downtown Dallas, like a Navy officer, but not quite that way, and I asked him what he did. He was a radio officer in the Merchant Marine, and he told me how you could enlist, go through boot camp, and possibly be selected to go to radio officer training. And at 17, looking for a technical degree, that looked much more attractive than sleeping in the mud or sleeping in a compartment with 100 other men.
Okay. Now, how old were you when you started college then?
16.
Okay. And what was that like, just being away from home at 16 up in Dallas?
Well, I didn't get to see a lot of Dallas because to pay for that, over a $500 scholarship, I had to make some money. And I was hired as a night fireman in one of the suburbs of Dallas. The job of a night fireman was to show up at 5 o'clock and get off at 7 in the morning and go on all the fire calls. which was useful in my later career and my career at sea, where I put out a fire in one of the Liberty ships.
Now, did you get a lot of fire calls out there?
Not a lot, which was one of the advantages.
So you got to do your studying then, at least?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And then, so you met this fellow. Once you decided to try the Merchant Marine, what did you do next?
Well, when I got down to Houston, where there was an enlistment office, I went in and signed up, and was called up for a physical exam first, and then for other minor questioning, and then was called up on the 5th of May to head for boot camp in Catalina, California, by Pullman train, as we found out. Then on the 8th of May, VE Day, we woke up sitting in Santa Fe Station in Los Angeles when a petty officer from Catalina came through shouting for us to turn out. There was a reporter and photographer waiting to see us because we were arriving at boot camp on VE Day, which was news to us. And they took our pictures, and we went to breakfast at a Fred Harvey hash house, as we called them. Then down to San Pedro, better known to us over the years as Pedro, where we were put on an excursion steamer that ran between San Pedro and Santa Catalina, taken out for our first day at boot camp. And the next day, when the newspaper came out from Los Angeles, there was our picture on the front page. I say our because it was of the group.
How many were you, do you think?
There were probably about 30.
Okay. And this was sort of a general Merchant Marine boot camp as opposed to more specialized?
Yeah, that was your first introduction. Many people, first time they'd seen water they couldn't see across. And you were taught the basics. First of all, you were given a uniform and shown how to use it, and given quarters, where we found out one thing, that the Merchant Marine was not segregated. A couple of Texas boys were put in with a couple of blacks from California, and told the petty officer, we're not going to sleep with the people in there. So the chief petty officer came by and said, well, you got two choices. You can sleep with them in there, or we'll put you back over on the beach and you can go home.
And how did they respond?
They got on fairly well.
Okay, because that's also something that people tend not to be aware of, because at this point the armed forces were not.
We're total. I think the Coast Guard may have been.
Yeah.
Segregated.
Our Army and the Navy and the Air Corps at that point were all segregated.
Right.
They were experimenting with some black units, but not just putting men right in there together very often. All right. Okay. Now, what kind of training do they actually give you there in the boot camp?
Well, of course, first thing was how to march. But we also got things like knot tying and ship nomenclature and firefighting, and we were taught how to load the 3-inch 50 cannon and a 5-inch 38. They demonstrated shooting a 20mm Oerlikon anti-aircraft gun, and two of our people were selected from the front row to actually fire it out at a small target beyond the casino there.
What kind of setup did they have at the camp? I mean, was it sort of standard military barracks kind of place, or converted to other buildings, or what was it?
One of the things that United States Maritime Service, which was the training group for the Merchant Marine, did was that they sought out resort type real estate, which was not being used very much in the middle of the war, and worked it up as a base. First, we went into the Island Villa, which was a series of huts, 2 huts twinned onto a bathroom, and 4 men in each of the huts that normally would have facilities for 2 vacationers. You moved from there after 2 weeks to one of 2 hotels that had been, well, all the doors had been taken off and everything painted gray. See, I can't remember the name of the one I was in right now, but it was one that had been a favorite then of Hollywood actors. And it was the furthest from the mess hall. But mess hall was a former cafeteria in center of Avalon. And we got to march by the casino several times a day.
Were there people using the casino? I mean, was that still getting patrons, or?
The upper part, which was a restaurant, was in use, and I believe it was mainly for the people from the staff. And then the lower part was a movie theater, and that gave moving pictures every night, all for free, of course. And we did have one of Disney's traveling groups come in to entertain us.
What would a Disney traveling group have? What kind of thing did Disney provide?
Oh, it was sort of a, what do you call them, where there were a lot of acts and singing and...
So sort of a variety show kind of thing?
Yeah, variety show would be describing it.
All right. Now, how long did they have you in the boot camp?
That was 6 weeks.
Okay.
This had been cut down from longer during the war as all the training was shortened.
Okay. As far as you could tell, was there much of an effort to recruit people into the Merchant Marine at this point?
Yes, there was a fair amount. In fact, one of the major sources was that if you went to one of the services and for some reason they didn't feel that they could take you, they might recommend that you go to the Merchant Marine recruiting office and try there. And for radio officers, if your problem was vision, or, well, if it was something like vision, you could have that waived because it didn't, you weren't going to be in a position where you had rotating machinery or other sort of hazardous equipment. The way that they did it was they signed you on and gave you a promotion to third class steward's department, the lowest rank in the steward's department. And then as soon as you got to the boot camp, you got demoted. So you were just like everybody else.
All right. Now, from boot camp, how do they decide where to send people?
Well, you could request, and then you would be assigned essentially randomly for the position, and if they had calls for enough people in that position to get down to your name, you were sent to that. There were 2 sets of evaluations that you could volunteer for. One was for radio officer and the other was for purser and pharmacist mate.
Mm-hmm.
I signed up for radio, of course, and we were called in to, first you took an exam where they played a phonograph record that had dits and dies on it, pairs of them, and the record might play did it, and you had a score sheet to mark same or different.
Mm-hmm.
And when you completed that, then there was an interview with an officer. And one thing I've always marveled at is, due to the record of graduations from radio training, it was remarkable how well those men chose, because our failure rate in school was very low,
Mm-hmm.
and that was based on maybe 15 minutes of interview.
That is pretty impressive. Works better than most colleges I can think of. All right. So basically you went through that and then you were selected. So what happens then? What do you do next?
Well, actually in the 6th week of your training, that was work week,
Mm-hmm.
you were doing the grunt work to support the people behind you. Mine was 12 to 16-hour days in the bakery. And when I was called up for the interview, I was in sweat and flour-covered dungarees, which I worried about. And I asked him what my chances were. And he said, "Oh, son, I wouldn't worry about it."
Mm-hmm.
So I worried whether that meant I was in or I didn't have a chance. And when I was at my lowest, towards the end of that week, one of my section mates ran in and said, "Jim, you made it." And that made it for the week.
Mm-hmm.
Then we packed up. We were told we were assigned to Hoffman Island, a small group of us. And we packed up, and Sunday morning, bright and early, we boarded the Avalon, that steamer,
Mm-hmm.
went back over to San Pedro, caught the interurban into Los Angeles, got on a Pullman train, traveled all the way across the country.
How long did that take?
Took 6 days.
Wow.
Got off in famous station there,
Grand Central or Penn
Grand
Station?
Central. Found out what a subway was.
Mhm.
Went down to South Ferry. Walked up out of that station. Were met by a petty officer. 17, 18-year-old men,
Mm-hmm.
boys, traveling all the way across the country for a week. And met a man the minute we walked off the transportation, went across the South Ferry, and were taken by a launch out to Hoffman Island.
Now, describe the Hoffman Island facility for us. What was that like?
Hoffman Island had been built in New York Harbor originally as hospital for people coming into the country, foreigners, immigration. Yellow fever was a problem and so forth. It had been used in World War I by the Navy, and eventually wound up in World War II as a maritime training station. It was sort of like one of the old first metal battleships, with a pointed bow on one end and a pointed stern on the other and a straight line in between, with a seawall built around it, filled in, and then there were brick buildings built on it. And then as time went by, there were other frame buildings. It was very isolated. There was, the only communication was official communication from the cadre. We were a mile offshore from South Beach and had a very good view of the New York Channel and could watch the ships coming in and going out.
All right. And what was the routine like there as you were training?
Well, it was a real break from boot camp. We were assigned the first week there as work week. You'd have anything from serving the officers in the officers' mess down to what the other biggest guy and I got, which was shoveling out the incinerator. And we wondered what the heck all this stuff that looked like paper stacked up was for. And we found out when we started learning code, where you had to listen for the word, which was, a word was random letters, 5 to a group. And you started at 3 words a minute. That sounds very slow, but when you start, that's very fast. And that, all the paper stacked up was the paper you were writing on with your pencil to record what you were listening to. We were in Flying Cloud Barracks, which had room for 2 sections of trainees.
And how large was the section?
About 30 men.
Okay.
It varied slightly, but that was a good number. And we had good food for the most part. We learned about broccoli of southern types. Well, we didn't get a chance to get even with the northerners by introducing them to kale or the other leafy vegetables that some southerners liked. 3 good meals a day. You went by sections. We had double bunks in an open area inside the barracks, and had metal storage areas. There's an interesting thing there, is that one night, when we were getting up to maybe 5 or 6 words a minute, in the middle of the night, someone reared up and said, "Shut off that code generator." And we all popped up, awake, and sure enough, generated sounded like code. Just a little too fast for me to copy. And the petty officer for our section ran out and started running around trying to find the source, and rousted out the section leader from the next section over, and they searched down until they finally found out it was a squeaky bearing and the heating element fastened up to the ceiling like they used to be in the service bays and filling stations.
Mm-hmm.
Next day, why, three of us who were buddies after lunch were lounging on the rocks around the perimeter, and I said, you know, I sure was glad they found that, because I thought I could just about read it.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the guys from out in Kansas said, me too. A guy from California says, what are you guys worried about? I was reading it. That was the toughest part. Well, your students' capabilities were generally naturally divided.
Mm-hmm.
Some people were a whiz at code and could get up to 25, 30 words a minute without a lot of strain.
Mm-hmm.
And some people were very good at theory. I was on the theory side.
Mm-hmm.
So not a lot of people really took quickly to both. That was a curiosity. We did get a informal demonstration of a guy copying about 50 words a minute, an instructor. 50 words a minute with his right hand and 48 with his left.
Wow.
At the same time.
Now, how fast were you expected to get?
You had to get to 16 words a minute to pass the FCC requirement for a second-class radio telegraph license.
Okay. And how fast did you get while you were training?
Well, they didn't tell you at the end. They were pushing us hard for reasons we'll get to. But it must have been no less than 18 because every one of us passed the code test at the FCC.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, about how many hours a day did you spend just trying to practice the code and that kind of thing?
Well, it was theory in the morning and code in the afternoon, so you had about 4 hours of theory and 4 hours of code, and you could study voluntarily more, or if you were a little bit behind, you could study involuntarily more.
Now, did you get any chance to go over to New York City or anything else like that?
Oh yes, we were restricted to the island for 2 weeks. Then on the third weekend that you were there, if you satisfied the academic requirements, you were granted leave from noon on Saturday until midnight Sunday. Actually until 8 a.m. Monday, but you better get back before then. Which meant that we went on the Mayflower, another smaller excursion steamer, from Hoffman Island over to South Ferry, and then you were on your own, which usually meant for us out-of-towners, Times Square.
Mm-hmm.
There were organizations there that gave us, if you were lucky, you could get a ticket to one of the Broadway shows, you get tickets to the movies, and things like that, and hotels in general that had things like the basketball courts or open spaces like that, gymnasiums. They would set up cots, and you could have Saturday night in a cot and continental breakfast on Sunday for $1, which would be about $10 now. We were paid in the neighborhood of $30 a month.
Okay. Now, did you get to see anything particularly notable or interesting while you were there? That way, shows or acts or anything else like that?
Oh, Manhattan was an outstanding place to visit at the time. Radio City Music Hall, the radio broadcasting facilities,
Mhm.
and from RCO,
RKO?
R,
There's RCA and there's RKO, and
RCA, the RCA building,
mhm.
and Red and Blue Networks. Um, I met a family there through responding to an offer for a bicycle tour of Manhattan,
Mhm.
of Middle Manhattan, and there were a lot of things like that.
Mhm.
It was a very nice place to visit.
Right. Now, how long did they keep you on Hoffman Island then? So it was a 6-week course or longer than that?
No, it was a 20-week course
Okay.
of the basics, plus once you had your license, there was a Navy course on code, on the sending messages in code that had to be decoded, and then actually operating the equipment that you would have on your ship as if it were at sea.
Mhm. Now, once you completed the training, did they give you a break, let you go home, or did they immediately start putting you on ships?
That varied according to the demand. The standard was 2 weeks leave on your way to your ship. Some people, they were pressing so hard to get radio officers on ships, didn't get that. You were sent to an assignment location, which was a maritime union office in a port, and they then would assign you with some flexibility to a ship from that port. You might have to travel to another port to meet that ship, or you might have a pierhead jump. Pierhead jump is when they tell you you're going on this ship and there's the taxi and you'd arrive, get on board, and I did a pierhead jump in the peacetime in Houston, where as soon as my foot hit the deck, they cast off.
Okay. Now, at the point when you finished your training, was the war with Japan already over?
My group was still in training at the time that the Japanese surrendered.
Mm-hmm.
After about 2 more weeks, it was decided that the supply of radio officers was enough, and they were going to close the station.
Mm-hmm.
So when we got back from Weekend Liberty, we were met at the dock by staff who asked you what section you were in. And if you were in below a certain section in training, they told you to report to your barracks. If you're between 2 numbers for sections, it was to go over to that building, 2nd floor, and there was a multiple guess test of at least a 1/4 inch thick
Mm-hmm.
down on the table, and you took that test, and about 2 o'clock in the morning you got to your bunk. Then the next morning, you were called out regularly, and the petty officers said, okay, I have this list, called off names and said, you follow him, and the rest of you go back in the barracks and pack your gear. You'll be transported to Sheepshead Bay, the big boot camp, and
Was that merchant marine training or Navy or
no,
what?
that was still merchant marine training, where you could be reassigned,
Right.
or you could resign and go home.
Okay. Now, what group were you with? 'Cause
I
you
was
were-
in that group that said, follow me, and we were taken to classes.
Mhm.
Said, you'll do your routine. But think there were 12 of us, 2 of whom took the choice of resigning, and the rest, 9 of us went through several more weeks of training to get to 16 instead of 20. Then we were taken before the FCC inspectors, and our regular examinations given, and all of us passed for first class license.
Okay. Now that the war was over, what did they need merchant marine people for?
Well, one of the most popular things they needed us for was there a lot of people in a lot of places that wanted to go home. And also, there was a lot of the world that had been torn up. And we helped win the war, and now we had to help win the peace. So we were hauling fuel and food, usually bulk food like grain, all over the world.
Now, what was the first ship you were assigned to?
Well, those of us who had gone through this extra plan were released when we got our license, and you were on your own. I went back to Galveston area and joined the union that did the assigning. Only now it was a different system, and shortly was assigned to a T2 tanker in Texas City.
Okay. Now, how large was a T2 tanker?
About 14,000 deadweight tons.
Okay. And about how long was the ship?
Oh, somewhere around 500 feet.
All right. And about how many men in a crew for that?
There were 42 at that time. Crews were coming down in size because every ship that went to sea during the war had an exaggerated crew.
And why did those ships have larger crews?
That was to take care of casualties, to man. There were the 42 men. There was not counting the armed guard, which manned the guns that had been put on them. But you needed more people. You had 3 radio officers, for instance, to keep watch around the clock, 4 hours in each watch. You had to feed more people, so forth. But now you could bring that down under the forces of competition. That was my first assignment, and I was assigned alone.
So you were the only radio man?
Radio officer.
What officer, yes.
Radio man has a sort of says you were in the Air Force or the Navy and an enlisted man.
Right.
At a fairly low rate.
I'll keep that in mind. All right. So you're the only radio officer on the ship then?
Right.
Okay. Now, where did the ship go?
We went down through the Panama Canal. We were supposed to go to Saipan, but we were diverted, the first message I ever received, to Pearl Harbor and discharged our Bunkers Sea Oil cargo there for the ships coming back from Far East. From there, we were directed in ballast to San Pedro, where I got my first big shock. The war was over. The FCC went on peacetime regulations. You needed your license plus 6 months experience at sea with a first radio officer to supervise you, and then your license would be endorsed to sail alone.
Mm-hmm.
So it was pack your gear and get off.
Okay. Where did you get assigned next?
Well, it wasn't assignment. You had to scrounge out your own.
Mm-hmm.
I was told that I might get on a ship that had more than one radio officer in San Francisco. So I made my way up there, and the union people there laughed and said, no such thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew, as many people in my circumstances knew, that you could get a purser's license fairly easily. So I got my purser's license and was told, well, you might get a ship in New York.
Okay.
So I sat up in a coach train from San Francisco to New York. One of the cars I was in seemed to have been taken out of a museum during the war.
Mm-hmm.
It had wooden seats, all of that. By then, primitive
Mm-hmm.
situation, and the drinking water froze in the tanks at the end of the car going over the coastal mountain range.
Mm-hmm.
Got to New York, and the family that I'd met there was very kind and put me up while I waited. And that's also the first time I dodged the draft. When I'd come ashore in San Pedro, I had just turned 18, and I registered for the draft, and I transferred it to New York when I got there, and they seemed to think that here's one we can take instead of one of our boys.
Mm-hmm.
So I got a call for a physical exam, and I knew it wouldn't do any good to appeal to them, so I took a chance and went down and appealed to the state board headquarters in Manhattan. And the young woman listened to my story and said, I think you should talk to my supervisor.
Mm-hmm.
This older woman came over and I talked to her. She said, I think you should talk to the general. Now I didn't know whether they would give me time to get my gear before they had me in
Mm-hmm.
on my way to some training camp. Took me in to this big office with a retired, I think he was a lieutenant general,
Mm-hmm.
in charge of, was secretary of the New York State Draft Boards. And I told him my sad story, and he leaned back in his chair. And then he said, son, we're going to get you a ship. And they can't take you for weeks. I'm going to get you a ship.
Mm-hmm.
So he did. And I went to the company offices in Manhattan, and they gave me an advance and a ticket to Norfolk.
Mm-hmm.
And at Norfolk, I joined the Liberty ship and shortly sailed on an interesting voyage, which was with coal, about 10,000 tons of coal for Funchal, Madeira. And we got there. Funchal is off the northwest coast of Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And was I guess something like a state out of the nation of Portugal.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it had been a favorite British resort
Right.
visit, and was famed for its wines and lace.
Mm-hmm.
So, also, while they had been neutral all through the war, they'd been in the middle of the battles because the ship routes came very close to them. And so not a few merchant ships were torpedoed fairly close by. We were greeted by the governor, who came on board, inspected the ship. We unloaded half of our cargo there, and then sailed off for the Cape Verde Islands, which were then a colony of Portugal.
Right.
We were there on Easter week, and our contact official, instead of the American consul, was the British consul, as they served for us. Our captain was a naturalized American Englishman and an Anglican, and the British consul had him lined up to read the message at the little English church, and told me I would back him up because the captain liked his drink. Well, fortunately, I kept him sober. But we were invited to the Easter ball at the local European, Portuguese club, and were passed through a receiving line that included the officer, I think he was colonel in charge of the garrison, who assigned one of his officers to each of us, and I drew his doctor. And we had a wonderful time there. It would take a bit of time. I'll just tease you a little and say that my ignorance of the social laws of the Portuguese almost got me married before I knew it, because I danced 3 times with a young lady, and 2 was the limit, unless you were proposing to her. She had a huge smile on her face, but my escort got me to the British consul, who explained things, and I headed back to the ship instead.
Okay. And there wasn't some man with a large knife coming after you, making you marry his daughter.
Well, I think he would have had a pistol.
Yeah, the knife is in the Philippines. I had one of those stories too. All right. Now from there, where do you go?
From there, we were empty and went down around the bulge of Africa and picked up what were called crew boys, which were natives from Liberia who rowed the ships to clean them for their next cargo. Then we went over to the Cameroons and loaded a half load by volume of cocoa beans. From there we came back to Takoradi in British West Africa and loaded magnesium ore, half a load by weight. And from there we went over to the Ivory Coast, French coast, and loaded hardwood logs on deck. It was there that I got a real exercise in a situation, medical situation in that area of the world. One of the men, well, 2 men to load a log would get on the logs, and then reach down under it and pass a sling, a rope that you would use to lift a log. And the logs, there was quite a sea swells there constantly, and the logs were banging together. And he didn't get his hand out quickly enough, and just right here on his wrist, why it pinched up a strip of skin. They brought him to me, and I looked at it, and it was very simple. I took a scalpel and sliced that little slice of skin, and put merthiolate on it, bandaged it up, and said he's not to go in the water. Well, I could see that afternoon that he was getting quite a hazing from his fellow workers in their language, and everybody laughing at him because his job was sitting on a log on deck and counting logs as they came on board. He didn't have to go in the water and work anymore. So the next morning, as I was going up for breakfast past our little one-room hospital, why, I found the chief of their group and all of them lined up in the passageway. And I asked the chief, "What's this for?" He said, "Well, you treated my man yesterday, won't you treat my man this morning?" And I said, "I know, 18-year-old officer, I know malingering when I see it." So I took care of the guy with the skin pinched off, and then I took out a pint of merthiolate and a pint of alcohol and a couple of swabs. These guys would step up and their arms were bare and it looked like some little scratches all over it. So I swabbed that down first with alcohol, which didn't leave a mark but stung like hell. Then I swabbed it down with merthiolate. Not going to see them again. Next morning, same thing. I said, I treated this yesterday. And their head man said, "But you must treat it again today." I said, "Why?" He said, "The last time that a ship was here, it was French. They loading logs, and the purser wouldn't treat my men. So everyone was down sick. Everyone was sick for almost a week. 2 men were down in their huts and couldn't get out of them for a week." So I felt about that high. I said, "We don't need this alcohol." He says, no, do what you did yesterday, because it had worked. So for 5 days, every morning I was swabbing them all down, first with alcohol and then with merthiolate, and feeling that I really had been a fool, but they were pathetically grateful. There's an old mariner's saying, "Beware the bite of Benin," which is that area down under the bulge. And it's not just for sailors. That was then an extremely poor place to live.
Right. Now, going from there, now, did you bring that cargo finally, once you had it in the ship clean, did that come back to the United States, or did you go take that somewhere else?
No, that came back to the States. That was one of the very few cargoes ships that I was on brought back to the States during the time, the 5 years that I was actually at sea.
Now, when you had signed up, what was the length of time you had signed up for, or was there any particular expectation for how long you'd be in?
There's a document called signing articles, and on that it says that you agree to serve for a particular number of months that range from 3 up to 18. And you don't have to get off, you can sign another article, it's over, and continue. But if you want to get off at the end of that time, if you're any place in the world, they have to get you back to your port of sailing. Now that's rare, but certainly on the runs from the Persian Gulf out to the east and shuttle runs, why that did occur, and people were brought home at the end of their time. But the basic thing was that the first time you touched an American port, after you sailed from American port, the articles were broken.
Mm-hmm.
Then the crew had these options. Let's see.
Now, how long did you sign up for originally?
Well, you signed for each voyage.
Okay.
That's one thing that was different from the armed forces.
Mm-hmm.
If you went out on a voyage during the war and you came back and touched the U.S., you could sign off and walk away.
Mm-hmm.
You had no obligation any further. Now, the major reason that people would do that during the war was that they knew that they would be drafted or they would go over and enlist
Mm-hmm.
in one of the services where it was safer. Because the Merchant Marine had the highest loss rate of any American service, just ahead of the Marine Corps,
Mm-hmm.
well ahead of the Navy, and very far ahead of the Army. The reasons for that is that they're different services doing different jobs, and all of our support was civilian, established before the war
Mm-hmm.
on American soil. And we were not officially going to go into combat where you might have to replace casualties and things like that. So we were a smaller operation. We had more at risk.
Mm-hmm. And so most of you would be at sea at any given time, at least in the middle of the war, rather than in a base somewhere or something else like that.
There's an old Navy ditty about I joined the Navy to see the sea. What did I see? I saw I forget the rest of it. The Merchant Marine could have had one that said, I joined the Merchant Marine to see the sea. And what did I see? I saw the sea.
Mm-hmm.
When you signed on a ship, you went to sea because ships aren't doing any useful function tied alongside a dock.
Mm-hmm. Now, how far along were you time-wise when you were out there off West Africa, Cape Verde, Benin, Cameroon, that area, on that voyage? When was that roughly?
That was 46.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, after that voyage was over, did you get a chance to go home, or did you just get on another ship again?
No, I got on another ship. And, I met the captain in the company's office in Manhattan, and we went by Pullman day car down to, no, this was a little different. First, I got to go home. I was called back and made my first flight from Hobby, Houston to LaGuardia in a DC-3
Mm-hmm.
with 13 stops on the way. And I was assigned to a captain, and we were assigned to a ship that was moored there to be put in the reserve fleet. A Liberty ship that had been a transport, troop transport.
Mm-hmm.
And we inventoried. I got to practice my typing skills on lists and lists of inventory. Then we were hooked to a tug and set out for the James River Fleet layup, where many, many ships were, and some still are,
Mm-hmm.
anchored. in reserve in case there's a need. There were 4 of us on the ship, and the captain said, "You're the cook."
Mm-hmm.
And he and 2 mates stood the 3 watches under tow. I had a camping table, gas stove, a bunch of utensils, a case of steak, case of bacon, case of eggs, and so forth, a case of everything to cook. And the first morning, we were towed out at night. First morning, why, I cooked up bacon and eggs and toast. Cooked the bacon, and as we did out in the country, cooked the eggs in it.
Mm-hmm.
Captain took 1 bite. He was a naturalized American Dane, 64 years old. Took 1 bite and said, "What you cook this in?" I said, "Bacon grease, like always." Says, "You have plenty butter." I had a case of butter. "Have plenty butter. Everything you cook from now on will be cooked in butter."
At this point, his tape is just about up. So, all right, we've gotten to the point where you had gotten your cook's training and your lecture from the Danish captain. Did you do a lot of that kind of thing? Did you bring a series of ships down to the James, or did you just do that once and then go do something else after that?
No, we did that once. We tied up, turned the ship over to the caretakers, gave all the excess food to the crew on the tug.
Mm-hmm.
They lived high on the hog, and joined the ship there that had loaded coal for Denmark.
All right.
And this was the captain's home,
Mm-hmm.
where he had gone to sea first as a cabin boy at the age of 12.
Now, did he tell you anything about what he did during the war?
Not so much during the war, but he told me about his early life going to sea. We went across the English Channel and stopped off Deal at the eastern end for instructions to cross the North Sea, which was still heavily mined. And a launch came out and gave the captain, well, the second mate, the navigator, a stack of charts and our instructions. See that buoy over there? Steam straight for it. When you get there, why, here's your course for the next leg. Steam until you see that buoy and steam to it. Or if you can't see it, why, stop and anchor. And I'd call for help. We did this across the North Sea to the Skaw, which is the passage from the North Sea into the Kattegat. If I got that right. Down on the eastern side of Denmark
Yeah.
to Copenhagen, where among the places we moored was between the two of the finest breweries in the world, Carlsberg and Tuborg.
Right.
And I didn't drink beer at the time. Never had a bite, sip. We discharged the coal there, and then came out and around to the Havre to take on fuel. We had to wait for the high tide because tides can run 35 feet there.
Wow.
Went in on the high tide to the single lock that was left after the bombing, passed a Liberty ship that had stumbled on a mine and been blown in half that was sitting waiting to be broken down. We took on fuel for 4 hours on the high tide and had to do it quickly to get back to sea. So quickly that the pilot, French pilot, didn't go ashore. He had breakfast with us, complaining all the while about how the French food was so much better than ours, while he ate 3 helpings of bacon and eggs. Food was pretty scarce still.
Right.
From there, we went across to the St. Lawrence River, went up the St. Lawrence, which was a beautiful tour, to Montreal, where we loaded wheat for Scotland, about a little less than 10,000 tons of wheat. Went back out in the into the beginning of North Atlantic winter.
Oh.
And we had a rough time across. But the big gulls that followed us didn't. They followed us all the way across, sometimes lighting on the sea to sleep for a short time. We were their food source, and they loved it. When we got to the Clyde River mouth, why smaller gulls came out to claim us after the large ones that established that they were the boss, why they took off on a ship that was headed out to sea. And we went up the Clyde, where we discharged the grain. One of my lessons there was the captain sent me up town to the agent's office, and our draw had all been in pounds, which were worth about $4.05 then. I went and got on one of the articulated trolleys, and a woman with a huge leather pouch over her shoulder said, "That'll be 2 halfpenny." And I think, 2 halfpenny, how much of a pound is that? And she thought, oh, he's American. That will be 2 pence half pound, please. 2 pence half pence, please. And I just handed her the pound note. She said, "Hey, nothing smaller." I said, "That's all I've got." And she says, "Well, you will know." And I got off with 21 coins in my right front pocket with a little bit of a starboard list.
Pause here.
Can you stop for 1 second?
Yes, that's good. All right.
Then I had to make a phone call. I put the coins in and dialed, and a voice said, press button, ah. I couldn't understand it several times, and a woman passing by looked at my uniform and heard the voice and said, "Press button A," and reached past me to under the shelf where there's a white button marked A. You dialed, you made the connection, and then you put the money in, and it opened the circuit to let you talk. Things can be very different in other countries.
That's quite true. All right. Now, where did you go from there?
See, that took us to Scotland. We came back out and headed down around Florida into the Gulf. And we loaded in Galveston with milo maize, which is that grain that's round and
Right, mile, yeah.
dark, buckshot size. Many people don't know what it is. Some that we tried to give it to. We sailed off from there to Trinidad, where we fueled. From there, we went across the line down to South Africa and Cape Town, on the way, one of the messmen was a blonde with a California bronze tan. He was out in the sun as often as he could be.
Mm-hmm.
Came to me one day and says, "First, you got anything for sunburn?" I was purser assistant radio on that ship. Got anything for sunburn? And I said, "Yeah, but where are you sunburned?" He seemed to be tanned even between his toes. He reached up and said, "I went to sleep.
Oh,
Each eyelid was a white blister."
wow.
So I gave him some ointment that wouldn't hurt his eyes, kept it greasy for him. We got to Cape Town and we were supposed to fuel in 4 hours and sail, but the captain didn't come back from downtown. Every time before, when he went ashore on business, he took me, but this time he wouldn't. And they sent a doctor down to the ship saying he was ill.
Mm-hmm.
They were bringing him aboard. Well, it was about 8 hours before they got there with him, and he was suffering a very severe stroke.
Mm-hmm.
So the doctor dragged the office man out of the taxi, shoved and jumped in himself, yelled out the door to the chief mate and I, "Get another taxi and follow me." We did. They said that he would not be sailing with us. And we went back to the ship, and when we went aboard, why, the guard there said, "So your captain died, huh?" We said, "No, we took him to the hospital." He said, "No, what I mean is your captain is dead." So we spent 3 days, due to time differences and a weekend, to get permission from the company and the authorities to promote the first mate to captain, and the third mate was an elderly gentleman who had a license for captain, but was sailing third, so he didn't have the responsibility, and sailed short of a man. Now, when we arrived, they said there was yellow fever in Mombasa, Kenya, where we were to fuel again, and we had to have a shot before we could go. And our captain, the Dane, had said, "I was 65 years old. I never had a shot in my life. I not take one now." So the doctor and I lined him up, got everybody a shot, and the doctor turned to the captain and said, "Well, Captain, your crew and your ship can go on, but you'll stay here." So he took the shot, the only one he'd ever had in his life, and when hours later he was dead. Now, I don't know if there was any connection, but we sailed on through the Mozambique Channel, where I turned 19 years old, and fueled in Mombasa, where we were there less than 4 hours. The captain and I were the only ones who got ashore up to the office, and the interesting thing to me there was that when they gave us a draw of money, small draw of money, there were quite a few coins in it. Some of them were very beautiful, but some of them had a hole in the middle. And there was a strip of cloth torn off, tucked through that hole and tied off, so they were in a bundle. And that was the way that they handled their money. Also in the cab to the ship, why, he had the radio on, and there was music, which was interrupted by a voice that said, "We have this message for Mr. and Mrs. so-and-so on safari to Nairobi." And we said, "What's this?" We'd heard of safaris, but the driver explained that, well, the roads are so bad, and there are all kinds of natives between here and there, and game and so forth, so that it's customary to pass any messages and have them have the ability to call us with messages or in case of emergencies. That was the status of development
Mm-hmm.
in that country at the time. From there we headed across the Indian Ocean, and we're just approaching the Mozambique Channel, not the Mozambique, the
Malay Straits or.
Straits of Malacca.
Mm-hmm.
And we were diverted to names sometimes get to me now, but up in Malay, Georgetown, Penang.
Mm-hmm.
When we got there, we were supposed to discharge our 10,000 tons, and they said, "We don't want it. We have go-downs, warehouses, stacked to the ceiling with flour in bags."
Mm-hmm.
So we anchored out for almost 2 weeks waiting for the relief authorities in Paris to decide where we should go from there. It was a beautiful place, and it is known as quite a resort
Mm-hmm.
area there, now in Malaysia. But there was a sad thing happened starting there. That was one of our oilers, which is the man who lubricates the moving machinery, had been standoffish to the people he was sent with from New Orleans to join the ship in Galveston. And before we sailed, they invited him out for a last run on the saloons,
Mm-hmm.
and he just turned away from them, shaking his head. Well, now, he was an alcoholic. He was a very severe alcoholic.
Mm-hmm.
Some men go to sea to get away from it because you can't have any liquor
Mm-hmm.
on a ship at sea. Not unless you're Navy or British.
Right.
And he sort of disappeared ashore. Came aboard once, got all of his gear and took it ashore. And on our sailing day for Bombay, he was picked up by the police, almost as good as dead, in an alleyway with a pair of dirty khaki shorts, singlet, and a pair of rubber sandals, dead to the world.
Mm-hmm.
They'd brought him around, but he was in severe reaction to being very, very drunk.
Mm-hmm.
The doctors advised us to leave him there, but it's a terrible decision to decide to leave a man halfway around the world
Mm-hmm.
from his home. So we decided to take him, the captain decided. And everything was fine until the middle of his first watch down below, where the heat was very high, and he wandered off. And it was obvious he was going into the DTs. So eventually I wound up giving him the strongest sedative that I dared from the book, and walked back around by the crew's mess. They called me in to ask his condition, and I said, well, he's asleep now, and he will be for quite a while, because I gave him a pretty big dose. And another guy stuck his head in and said, "Talking about George?" he's out here by the scuttlebutt. So we had to put a man on him day and night. And he had one attack where he was closing all of the portholes. And when chief engineer challenged him on it very calmly, he said that that cyanide tank up on the hill up there is burst open, and I'm saving everybody's life. And it went on like this until we got to Mombasa, where he was treated and didn't have an incident coming back. But he went ashore when he was paid. He came back for his gear. He obviously had been at it again. It got him once. It was getting him again. It would get him until it killed him. Very sad.
Now, how far along has this taken us now in your journey? About what year was it then when you got him back to the States? In 48?
That was 47.
All right.
Just at the beginning of summer. And I looked at my payroll, from which I could save $600, which was then quite an amount. Said, I'm going back to school. So I caught this coastal ship hauling sulfur from Galveston to Tampa, and Griselli, New Jersey, which many New Jerseyans don't even know where it is. Those who are there may wish they didn't. And to Newport News area, back and forth. She was built as a steam schooner on the West Coast in 1914, converted from coal to oil in 1916, brought round in World War II to the East Coast to haul sugar from Cuba to the plants up in the States where it was turned into explosives. And while it was not the newest of ships, she had some regal touches. That summer, we found a hurricane in the Gulf off the Mississippi passes. I was the first one to radio to the Navy, who passed it to the Weather Bureau, and they came out with hurricane warning number one, and a very convenient ship. Then in the fall, I went back and picked up on for my engineering degree, and discovered that the first quizzes that studying wasn't the same as sailing. I had to get busy. Went through the academic year there, and see, that was 47, 48, summer of 48. I caught a Liberty ship from the Houston area, and we loaded with milo maize, with corn, field corn, for relief to Northern Europe. Then as you came up to the English Channel's southern entrance or western entrance, why you radioed ahead and identified yourself and cargo, and then they would, you had orders to sail for Falmouth. Falmouth was a little fishing village. No ship ever went there. And before you got anywhere near there, they'd tell you where to go, and this time it was to Bremen, no, yeah, Bremen,
Bremen or Bremerhaven or
no, Bremen.
okay, the main city then. Yeah.
Bremerhaven is the port down on the shore.
Mm-hmm. And Bremen is up the river a little bit.
Right, up the Weser. So we sailed up and picked up the pilot, went up the Weser, and it was a real tour. At the mouth, there was one of the submarine pens,
Mm-hmm.
and it had been demilitarized. We got a tour by the pilot. He was very congenial.
Mm-hmm.
I was not a Nazi, of course.
Right.
Everybody was not a Nazi.
Mm-hmm.
But he told us that sort of proudly, that pen the Americans had tried to destroy. No matter how much explosive they put in, they couldn't do any real damage. So they just filled it up with rubble and filled up the channel to the river and said, okay, it's destroyed. We came by what was his name, the German children's author. Anyway, a medieval, almost medieval type town
Mm-hmm.
with grass roofs on stone
Mm-hmm.
cut huts and cobbled streets, beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
We saw farmers out in green fields working with their plows and grazing animals.
What condition was the city of Bremen in? Because
Well,
that had been hit pretty hard. Right?
We haven't got there quite yet.
Okay. All right.
Pretty soon we came to little sort of shipyards with two ways to build a ship on and slide it into the river. All of them with a partially completed Type 21 submarine,
Mm-hmm.
which was a submarine that could outrun most of the escorts on the convoys, submerged,
Mm-hmm.
which was unthinkable because just about all the rest of the submarines in the world were about 9 or 10 knots capable underwater. They were being built in sections elsewhere, brought to the river to be joined up and launched. There were two that were completed, prepared for sea, and were actually headed out when the armistice came, or the surrender came. One of them made a totally undetected approach on a British cruiser and theoretically sank it before anybody knew it was anywhere around,
Mm-hmm.
and then surfaced and surrendered. There was not anti-submarine torpedo capable of attacking effectively against that type of submarine being issued to our Navy until about 1960. I know because I worked on it.
Mm-hmm.
Then we got to Bremen. We came in, we tied up by a little tin shed on a very sturdy wharf with that was still hand discharged. You could look over the top of that, and you had vision for about 120 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
And all you could see was very neat streets, checkerboard neat streets. Off in the distance, two looked like they were burned out bunkers, and the remains of the metal parts of a couple of churches.
Mm-hmm.
Everything else was rubble that had been thrown into basements to get it out of the way.
Mm-hmm.
Astern of us, there was a shipyard in which there were two Type 7 submarines, the smaller previous type, and two 21s on the ways, and three Type 17s destroyed in the water, and everything thoroughly burned from the bombing. It was sort of a chilling sight.
Mm-hmm.
It was, well, chief engineer said, let's go uptown. I said, well, I'm pretty tired. I looked at my watch. It was midnight. It just beginning to get good dark.
Mm-hmm.
An Army officer came on board with official papers, and then he said, please tell your crew that they have free run of all of the Army facilities here. All, you know, PX and everything. Says, please do not buy from the German stores. There's hardly enough there for the Germans. There was an ad that we saw for that 3 women were advertising for another person to join them in their new apartment. They had gotten together and gotten jobs and were in this apartment. Now they were looking for another occupant who must be a man. There have been so many men gone to the Russian front and didn't come back that they were looking for male companionship, which was common at the time.
Mm-hmm.
The morning that we were to sail, about midday, the crew from ashore was cleaning up the holes. We got word that Berlin had been blockaded.
Mm-hmm.
They couldn't see why we didn't immediately shut down the holes and head for sea down the river. And some of them seemed to be looking for a place to go with us.
Mm-hmm.
We came back across, and as we neared the American shore, we could pick up first real news we could get was Walter Winchell's Sunday evening broadcast. And by the time the crew had listened to that, most of them were convinced that we were either at war or just about to be at war.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Walter Winchell was the guy that would go, in the evening, ladies and gentlemen, and all the ships at sea.
Mm-hmm.
But he was one that was constantly attacking the merchant marine all through World War II and after.
Why?
Really? Who knows? That was one of our problems, that most people had a bad impression of the merchant marine, that they were a bunch of bums, never-do-wells,
Mm-hmm.
drunks.
Is there an assumption that these were people who were fit for the armed forces or whatever, and so they were there, or they must be trying to get away from that, or?
Don't really know, could never figure it out. There were a couple of those, and there's actually an official report written by a famous historian that had an account of American crew right in a war zone, active area,
Mm-hmm.
who refused to unload the cargo, and it had to be done by the Marine Corps. And in court, that was proved to be fictitious.
Mm-hmm. All right. You're worried.
Well, then after that voyage, it was time to go back to college again.
Mm-hmm.
And my long voyages had carried me through to carried me through 2 calendar years.
Mm-hmm.
Now, during the Christmas vacations, there was a thing called a relief operator. That is, a radio officer could take leave over the holidays if the unions could provide a competent operator
Mm-hmm.
to replace him.
Right.
And that 2 summers, 2 Christmas there
Mhm.
times, I caught Liberty ship first, and then the next time I repeated on the Sulphur Collier with runs to Tampa.
Mm-hmm.
And then you were paid airfare to go home, which I stuck in my pocket and caught the Greyhound.
Mm-hmm.
It was tight days for me.
Mm-hmm. All right. So let's see. So you're at the summer of '48, and then fall of '48, you're back in school again. You take sort of the Christmas trip, and then you're back in. Get to the spring of '49. Then did you take another ship out then the summer of '49?
Wasn't going on a summer vacation. I was going back to sea. I was flat
Right.
broke.
Mm-hmm.
My tidal balance on my account was showing its bottom,
Mm-hmm.
and I then caught a Liberty with my favorite captain at the time I went to sea, and we set off again with grain cargo relief from Galveston to with orders for Gibraltar,
Mm-hmm.
again to call in, and we were ordered then to go to the Free Territory of Trieste.
Mm-hmm.
Now this had been part of Austria. After World War I was given to Italy.
Mm-hmm.
After World War II was held by the Americans and British,
Mm-hmm.
until eventually it was given back to Italy. We arrived, of course, in the summer vacation time. The captain decided that he would like to go to Rome. So I set off to do all of the paperwork.
Mm-hmm.
Had to go to the American authorities to get released to cross the border outbound, and then to cross the border inbound again. And the Italian authorities for permits, and the Coast Guard.
Mm-hmm.
Coast Guard Lieutenant Commander was captain of the port. I went to see him, and he said, "You can't go to Rome." I said, "Why not?" He says, "Well, there's been activity in the sea there,
Adriatic?
the Adriatic. Some people think they've seen submarines, and suppose I needed you people real quick. Now, I could always replace the captain, but where could I get another radio officer?"
Mm-hmm.
So we talked, and he agreed that if we went over to Venice, that would be close enough he could send a car.
Mm-hmm.
And before I got back to the ship to tell the captain, he'd gone down there and gotten hold of the captain and said, "Suppose I had an emergency and I needed to order you to sail. You know, I could always get another captain, but where would I? No, I could always send a Army radio man
Mm-hmm.
in an emergency. Well, where could I get another captain?"
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, we made our way over, And wonderful visit. We repeated it on the next voyage, which is carbon copy. But there's one thing I'll always remember. That was that there was a group of typical New York Debs, I'll use them,
Mm-hmm.
with a couple of Grand Dame escorts
Mhm.
doing the immediate post-war tour,
Right.
grand tour. Captain had wanted to eat in a grand restaurant. What's more grand than the Grand Restaurant and the Grand Hotel on the Grand Canal?
Mm-hmm.
So we went there, and we were seated up above a well. The well had a large table at it. And in came this group, tour group. They were chittering away with things about how dirty the train had been. And Mussolini had at least been able to get them to run on time. And the hotel didn't have running ice water in your room like Manhattan,
Mm-hmm.
and things like that. And I looked at the captain, and he nodded. We were in uniform. And I started to get up, and somebody put their hands on my shoulders and pushed me back down in the chair and said, "That's all right, gentlemen. We understand." That was the Maître D'.
Mm-hmm.
And a little bit later he came back. We were still embarrassed as hell.
Mm-hmm.
He came back and he explained. He says, "We understand, gentlemen. We know about people like that. Here in Italy now, we have 3 menus. One is for people like them. One is for other Americans and Europeans. No. One is for people like them. One is for other Americans, and one is for Italians and Europeans.
Mm-hmm.
You're dining tonight off the 3rd menu.
Mm-hmm.
They're not.
Right.
So if you want to cut up in Europe, cut up in Italy,
Mm-hmm.
I expect this still costs you, and you may never know it."
Seen a few things like that myself. All right. Now, in the course of your trips, and you're going to make it in 1949 at that point, and you make a couple of these trips over to Europe.
To Trieste.
To Trieste.
Yeah.
All right. Then you eventually got over to Japan then as well.
Well, the next thing was that the 3rd trip with that captain on that
Mhm.
ship, we went into not Bremen, but the other major port there,
Was Hamburg or?
Hamburg, at Christmas time.
Mhm.
And as destroyed as Bremen had been, Hamburg had recovered.
Mm-hmm.
The world was being put back together.
Mm-hmm.
It was at Christmas time, and there were great displays. Then we started back, and for Norfolk, we didn't have a charter anymore. Ship was being paid until it reached port,
Mhm.
anchored in U.S. port. And the canny owners, one a Brit and one a Greek, had told us no ballast. We're going out in the winter North Atlantic.
Okay.
We headed down out of the English Channel, and the ship wouldn't come up against the wind onto course.
Mm-hmm.
And we wound up finally, after we circled off the wind to try to have the momentum to come up on it from the other side, and failed. Why the captain put water ballast in numbers
Mm-hmm.
4 and 5 hold, and we had walking on the bulkheads voyage, Liberty's role.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody agrees to Liberty's role. And I kept stacking stuff under the lee side of my bunk to try to push me against the bulkhead and hold me there. And the cabin steward had passed the word down below that Sparks has got everything in his cabin stuffed under his mattress. They were bunks were pointed thwartships, and ours and the officers' country were just about all 4 1/2.
Mm-hmm. So you go up and down that much more?
Well, yeah.
Yep.
And we were hired. It was quite a trip.
Mm-hmm.
We couldn't weather Bermuda, so we had a day tour down the seaward side of Bermuda, which was nice
Mm-hmm.
looking at. We came into Baltimore, and I could have used another trip because of scheduling, but they laid her up. And so I went back to college and completed a semester, and then, let's see, somewhere along there, I'd married the mousy little sophomore
Mm-hmm.
who'd sat next to me in Algebra 2 in high school, who wasn't a mousy little sophomore anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess, yeah, that was while at the end of that semester, first semester of 50,
Mm-hmm.
and she went off to, she graduated and went off to one of the famous medical clinics in the Midwest to start her internship in not physical, but therapy.
Mm-hmm.
There I was, 3 weeks married, flat broke, when and I was going to go back to sea. Went down to Houston and was told that things were dead on the East Coast, but they just got a call. Oh, the Korean War had just started.
Mm-hmm.
They got a call from the Navy to please send them as many radio officers as they could get. And that was to Seattle. So
Mm-hmm.
4 of us got together in one guy's ancient straight 8 Buick, pre-war Buick,
Mm-hmm.
rotten tires on it, it turned out, and headed from Houston to Seattle. And when we got there, we walked in and got a rather cool reception until we identified ourselves as radio officers,
Mm-hmm.
because we jumped the line that went out into the street
Mm-hmm.
of people that were applying, none of them radio officers.
Right.
And then they said, well, this was at closing time. They said, come back at 8 o'clock sharp in the morning. We did. They gave us a chief petty officer as an escort who got us through the process in 2 days instead of 5.
Mm-hmm.
And I was assigned to a C4 trooper being pulled out of layup down in San Francisco. Actually, it was in dry dock in Oakland at the time, being repaired. I was the first radio officer aboard. And we had 4 then. We had an elderly radio officer who might better have been retired.
Mm-hmm.
Then I was first radio officer. He was chief because he had a first class license.
Right.
I was first radio officer by dint of reporting in that order. Guy I'd met in Bombay, which we didn't talk about, came aboard as second radio officer, at first officer pay. Then there was a civil servant with no license, not required of government employees, who was third. And we eventually set out loading 3,000 troops. Half of them were Air Force ground personnel, half were infantry, for Yokohama. C-4 Trooper was the largest ship I sailed on. The first day out, we sailed midday or so, and the first day out, we were allowed into the Pacific and rolling. And I met the chief engineer going forward as I was going aft to the officers' mess. And he said, "No, they're not serving back there. Come on with me. We're going to the troop officers' mess." I said, "Why?" He said, "I don't know. They just passed the word." So we went up there and walked in. There was the chief steward and the chief cook with a table full of cold cuts and shortbread and fruit juice. And I said, you know, we never had something like that on a merchant ship, even when I was cooking. And I said, "What's with this, Chief?" He says, "Don't bug me." He says, "I got 300 men in the steward's department. Everyone's down sick in his bunk, except me and the chief cook. This is what you get tonight." So everybody from the lowest ranking soldier to the commanding officer of the troops on the way over, and us, had our cold cuts that night. And they had sterilized the freshwater tanks, and it made the water taste horrible. So I swiped a small orange juice, so that at least I'd have, can of orange juice. That's when I discovered frozen orange juice. So I ate it with a spoon as it thawed. We got a ways out, and about a third of the way across, and the main plant failed, propulsion plant. We were dead in the water. At the very start of the Korean War, not knowing what Russia was going to do and so forth. And so they told us, well, the captain sent a message down for Hawaii. And we're all in the Radio Shack, started to fire up the gear. We were on emergency power, all DC, and it wouldn't work. So everybody started scrambling. I finally found that the polarity was hooked up wrong, different from regular power and emergency power. So we had to convince the engine room to swap it, and got off our message. Then when they got the plant moving again, why everything switched back, had to change it back the wrong way again. Got a little further, and chief engineer came up to me and said, "Sparks, I understand that you're an electrical engineer." I said, "Well, no, I'm still a semester from it." And he says, "Well, that's close enough. Would you please help the chief electrician?" I said, "What's his problem?" He said, "Well, starboard evaporator won't work. Now, with 3,345 roughly people on board, and one evaporator, you're running close to disaster.
Is that what takes salt out of the water? Or?
Made fresh water out of
Right,
salt
right.
water for drinking and cooking.
Mm-hmm.
So we went down and I asked the chief electrician what the problem was. He said, well, this motor blows its fuses. I said, what did the yard say about that? Because it had to be signed off on. And he said, reached in his pocket and pulled out a buff tag with a wire cord on it, something written on the back, handed it to me, and it said, this motor blows fuses.
Oh.
So we figured out a temporary fix for it. Then the main plant failed again. This time, Hawaii said they were sending one of the big troop transports out to tow us to Hawaii. But we got going again, and they turned him back.
Mm-hmm.
Then when we got about a third of the way, we got closer, got in the Asian side, well, it failed again. And they said Hawaii came back with sending the general class trooper out to escort us and take the troops if the plant failed again and leave us. We were getting closer and closer to the real-active war zone. And fortunately it didn't fail, and I looked astern as we were entering Tokyo Bay, and there was a big ship just on the horizon that suddenly turned 180 and headed out. I think that was our escort troop ship, just caught up with us. So I could visit Yokohama, visit Tokyo, bought some stuff like a set of Narataki china for my wife, and we loaded several hundred dependents being sent back home now that there was a war on, probably a bunch of pilots' wives. And we were to sail on at 8 o'clock the next day, and about sunset we saw ships coming in and anchoring out in the bay. And the next morning when we cast off, they were gone. They'd gone to, we found out later, of course, that they'd gone to the Incheon invasion. That was a convoy we would have been in if we had not been in such bad shape. Such bad shape that general and an admiral came on board to inspect, met with the captain. Somebody heard the general say as they were leaving, not my ship's not on this, not my troops not on this ship for a combat mission. So I just barely missed that. Came back to Seattle, caught the train to Ann Arbor, where I visited a couple days with my wife. Then we parted. She headed for Buffalo, and I headed back and finished my last semester. And in the middle of the spring semester, I was an electrical engineer. Drove my little English Ford Anglia car up to Syracuse to report to General Electric. And at the end of the first week, got the rude news that you're always paid a week behind the week you worked.
Oh.
And so I said, where can I get some money so I can eat? And it was a struggle then to get established and have our first child born. but then I had been selected by the Naval Ordnance Department of General Electric to be a field development engineer at their station in Key West. And went down there and found that when I was working with the Navy, there were two situations. One was if you were working with a very senior officer or a very junior one, they were very superior to you.
Mm-hmm.
If you're working with one about a peer, they're very cooperative. I made some very good friends.
Mm-hmm.
And I was on the target submarine that torpedoes were fired at, exercise torpedoes. Why, I got to be great friends with the captain. I was working with a lieutenant who was he was the project officer on the evaluation. And we worked quite well together. And I met him later for a grand accidental encounter in Norfolk when I was there years later. He was a captain then, and I was there for a Navy 1-week school on anti-submarine warfare. Anyway, I worked for the next 20 years, and mostly anti-submarine warfare. I was taken for 2 years to Cocoa Beach, the Cape, on the Polaris program, and was the test director, fire control and guidance on the first Polaris shot that carried a guidance package. Didn't control, but it carried it. And of course, the bird failed again. Shortly after that, there was a torpedo emergency out in Keyport, Washington, and I was called to report to that effort to replace the chief man on our part of the program, the Mark 44 torpedo. We got that straightened out, and then I was transferred back to the torpedo work.
Okay. Well, we are just about out of time here. It sounds like we've gotten you sort of through the merchant marine career, which is the main focus of this, and kind of seeing how some of that carries forward into a long career as an engineer.
An important thing, I think, for people to know is how much that experience guided our future careers. Now, very few of us wound up in the same career, but a lot of us wound up as engineers. A lot of us wound up, in technical careers, and as I think I mentioned, the sea-story swapping that we entertained ourselves with in lieu of the things you have today when we were out at sea were very valuable in working with people